Thank you very much. We're very fortunate to have such musical talent in our church, aren't we? It's a real blessing, a real ministry of music. And we're blessed to live in Victoria at the moment. Got our lovely early autumn weather, and we're just about to head off to, in 2 weeks' time we go up to visit our Bev's relatives in Queensland, and I was talking to him, and they just live Redland Bay, just near Brisbane, on the outskirts suburbs of Brisbane, and they just had 1.2 metres of rain. So that's quite a lot of rain in just I think it was a matter of just days. So hopefully it won't be raining like that when we get up there. Today I'd like to look at a chapter in the Bible. In fact, probably the book of Judges is one of the most challenging lots of stories. Probably summed up when the Bible says everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And I'd like to look at a story, and I suppose a good story or a good parable is one that has a punchline that is a little bit unfinished. You sort of go away and you think, ooh, and it just keeps you thinking. Maybe it's an unexpected twist, it catches you out, it can challenge some of your core assumptions in life. And I suppose Judges 11 is one that's done that for me. I've read it in my devotions, studied it, and it keeps popping up like unfinished business. And so I'd like you to turn to Judges chapter 11, and I'll be reading to get the feel of the story from a modern translation, the New Living Bible. Now Jephthah of Gilead was a great warrior. He was the son of Gilead, but his mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife also had several sons. When these half-brothers grew up, they chased Jephthah off the land. "You will not get any of our father's inheritance," said. "You're the son of a prostitute." So Jephthah fled from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. Soon he had a band of worthless rebels following him. Okay. Not exactly a great start to life. We would say that Jephthah was someone who was dragged up. I know my son worked for quite a while as a policeman at Alice Springs, and he shared one day, tears in his eyes, about a 12-year-old boy that had just died. He'd been sniffing petrol, and he had got scared by something, and he'd gone running, just run into a car. But my son had developed a bit of a relationship with that boy, because he would pick him up at 2 o'clock in the morning walking and say, "Where are you going? Can I take you home?" "Oh, no point in going home." He used language that I wouldn't use up the front here, because back at his home everyone was drunk or drugged, or it was worse to be more dangerous to be home than it was out in the streets for a 12-year-old at 2 o'clock in the morning. I must admit I don't quite connect with that sort of, I don't understand that. I don't understand the framework. And as my son said, their value system, what that little boy had to do to survive, often pinching stuff from the shops simply because there was no money, there was no one else, nothing else. There was welfare payments, but his parents spent the welfare payments on alcohol. And so Jephthah, son of a prostitute, fled from his brothers, rejected by his dad, a mum that didn't have any moral values or whatever. And then he had a band of worthless rebels. Wow. It's one thing to be a rebel, but to be a worthless rebel, God. About that time, the Amorites began their war against Israel. When the Amorites attacked, the elders of Gilead said to Jephthah in the land of Tob, "Hey, come and be our commander, help us fight the Amorites." Jephthah said to them, "Aren't you the ones who hate me, who drive me from my father's house?" Yeah, here he was. He could have said, well, I was that little snotty-nosed kid running around, pinching from you, pinching your fruit, stealing because I just had to survive, and you didn't give me anything, you just chucked me out. Why do you come to me now? You're in trouble. Because we need you, the elders said. If you lead us in the battle against the Amorites, we'll make you the ruler. Oh. He said, let me get this straight. If I come to you and if the Lord gives me victory, you'll really make me ruler over all the people? God's our witness, the elders said. We promise whatever you say. Pretty desperate. No police force back in those days. No regional armies. Basically just roving bands, and the Amorites were a roving band that were going to come, and when they come into town, murder. What's happening in with Russia and Ukraine at the moment, it's like child's play compared to what went on in ancient warfare. One of the favourite messages they'd do is they would skin people alive. Okay. So they said, yeah, we're desperate. Then Jephthah met with the elders and the people, made him ruler and commander of the army at Mitzvah in the presence of the Lord. Jephthah repeated what he had said to the elders. So there's a bit of a change here. We've got this guy who probably became like the worst bikie that you can imagine. And now he's responding because he's needed. He's needed. Hold on. Oh, I got what's going on here. If I turn it on, it helps, I think. Maybe it's... If you can just click onto the next slide for me. For some reason, this is not obliging. Oops. Now it is working. Thanks. Okay. So we have a society of confusion, pagan, Yahweh mix. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That's That sort of sums up a society that was so disconnected from God. So, and this is probably where Jephthah's mum was probably a temple prostitute, which shows how confused the whole society was, because this was part of their worship. So here we have a very confused, very challenged situation. A pagan, if you ever look at Judges 10 and verse 6, and Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They served the images of Baal and Asheroth and the gods of Sim, Sam, Ammon. They abandoned the Lord and no longer served him at all. Okay, it's a pretty tough sort of a time. And then I go over to Judges 17 and verse 6. It says, in Israel there was no king. All the people did what was ever right in their own eyes. And right there, I think, is an interesting guidance. If you look at Judges 17, let's have a quick look at it. And here it says there's Micah, who lived in the country of Ephraim. One day his mum said, I heard you had placed a curse on a person who stole 1,000 pieces of silver from you. Well, I have the money. I was the one who took it. The Lord bless you for admitting it, the mother said. He returned the money to her, and she said, now dedicate these coins to the Lord in honour of my son. And up to that point you're going, oh yeah, this is a pretty good Bible story. And then he says, I will have an image carved and make an idol. What? So he returned the money to his mum. She took the silver to the silversmith, made an image and had an idol, and placed it in Micah's house, and had a shrine and all the other idols. And he installed one of his sons as a personal priest. And then the next verse said, in those days Israel had no king. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. One day a young Levite who has been living in Bethlehem arrived in the area. He was searching for a place to live. He stopped at Micah's house, and Micah said, where are you from? He says, I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah. I'm looking for a place to live. Micah said, stay here, and you can be a father and a priest to me. I'll give you 10 pieces of silver plus a change of clothes and food. And the Levi agreed to this. The man became like a son. So Micah installed the Levi as his personal priest, and he lived in Micah's house. I know the Lord will bless me now, Micah said, because I have a Levi serving as my priest. What do you do with a story like that? You ever heard a sermon on that one? No, because us preachers have no idea what to do with it. Doesn't say anything else about it. But right in the middle, which is the key part of a story in Hebrews, in Hebrew thinking, it says, all the people did what seemed right in their own eyes. And what it was saying is, this guy Micah, things were so confused about God, he was doing what he thought was right in his own eye. He was right. And the guy who stole the money from his mum thought he was doing the right thing, and then he thought it was the right thing to give it back, and then she thought it was the right thing to turn it into an idol, and they all thought it was the right thing when along came a Levi, and they said, well, hey, how about you be my priest as well? That means I'll be covering God from every direction. Yeah, it sort of leaves you scratching your head, doesn't it? Just really. But in some ways, it helps you, I believe, and it helps us identify with people and societies where things are very confused. We're like that little 10-year-old, 12-year-old boy in Alice Springs He would have had some sort of values. He was polite to my son, the policeman. But where would he have got politeness from? Definitely not from his home. Maybe it might have been a survival technique. He stole. Okay. Sniffed petrol. Escapism. And from my point of view, I would be going, shouldn't do that. Shouldn't do this. 10-year-old boys aren't supposed to be walking around at 2 o'clock in the morning. Only bad boys do that. Would you call him a bad boy because he's escaping from a terrible home? So here we have, I think, a little bit of something that helps me identify who Jephthah was. And when we read about Jephthah there, that first part is finally summed up. He soon had a band of worthless rebels following him. It's actually not too far from here. One of the traffic lights pulled up about a year or so ago, and a motorbike pulled up beside me, making a noise in the lane, and I looked across, and there was a guy looking at me, and there was not one bit of skin on his face that you could see because it was completely covered with tattoos. And even his eyes were different. It was like, what? And so if we talk about worthless rebels in our society, I think we'd probably talk about the bikie gangs. You know, they probably sum up the closest thing to worthless rebels. Totally different value system, totally different, you know. And that's really what Jephthah was. The nastiest, meanest thug around. And so when his former family or rellies suddenly have worse people coming to do worse things to them, they go, oh, who's someone that can protect us? Well, let's think of the worst bikie gang person. Oh, yeah, well, actually, he used to live here. I wonder if he's still got any empathy for his mother or his brothers. But let's ask him anyway. And they did. Yeah, a runt of a litter, dragged up kid that had to survive from day to day. Fight for food, bullied by older brothers, no morals from a mother, ignored from father. No doubt he was kicked out of home when he became good enough to fight a pack of 4 brothers by himself, probably. And then they told him to get lost. Nasty guy. Chopper Reed would be scared of this guy. No question. And then comes that twist in verse 4. And suddenly, he becomes good. He's, you know, when his village or his area comes and says, please, can you all come back? You know, would you really invite a bikie gang into our church or into your home or into your village? You could very likely be robbed, raped, smashed, killed, whatever it was. That's what they do, isn't it? But he didn't. He didn't. He showed an incredible forgiving attitude. And then he showed great diplomacy. If you want to read what he said to the Amorite king, he sent a message from a worthless rebel, a dropout. He was quite a diplomat. And what the Bible says there, he was spiritual as well. You know, there it says, where does it say? Verse 29, at that time the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. Wow. And he went through the land, etc. And up until that stage, you're going, oh, what a great story. What a great story. Because here we have someone from a terrible background, of terrible circumstances, ask by a manipulative crowd to come back and save them, and he does. And he does it in a spirit of God. And then verse 34, then Jephthah returned home to Mizpah. His daughter came out to meet him, playing on a tambourine and dancing for joy. She was the one and only child. He had no other sons and daughters. When he saw her, he tore his clothes in anguish. Oh, my daughter, he cried out, you've completely destroyed me. You've brought disaster on me, for I made a vow to the Lord that I can't take back. What was his vow? That if God would help him beat the enemy, the first thing that came out to greet him, he would sacrifice. And of course, what was he expecting? The pet lamb, the pet goat, the pet dog, the whatever. That was the first thing that would come out to greet you when you come home, isn't it? They were valuable, the cow, but not his daughter. She said, Father, if you've made a vow to the Lord, you must do to me what you've vowed. For the Lord has given you a great victory over your enemies, the Amorites. First thing, let me do one thing. Let me go up and roam in the hills and weep with my friends for a few months, because I will die without having children. You can go, Jephthah said, and he sent her away for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never have children. Then she returned home. Her father kept the vow he'd made, and she died without children. So it became the custom in Israel, for young Israelite women to go away for 4 days each year to lament the fate of Jephthah's daughter. Oh, you've got to be kidding. Gulp. What sort of a story is this? And I must admit, I have spent a lot of time reading a lot of commentators about this, looking in all sorts of different directions, and I would not like to say that I have the final answer on this one. Some, of course, say that he didn't kill her, she just started, like the modern nunnery. But that doesn't seem obvious when he would allow her to roam in the hills with friends weeping that she'd never have children. Well, why would she do that for a few months? Because that was the rest of her life. Others suggest that he sacrificed her and this was the start of his journey back into sin. There's a bit of a problem with that because in Hebrews 11 he's mentioned of those of great faith will be in heaven. Oh. The best commentaries in this passage unfortunately seem to support the reading of verse 39, that he sacrificed her. I tried to find a different conclusion, but not even the SDA Bible commentary seemed to come up with a different one. So that just doesn't seem right. I must admit, I can't, and maybe I'm not right. But months of bouncing it around in my head, I came to realise I was judging him and those times according to my Australian Western 20th century standards and values. Just like so many of the other stories in there. Like that guy who told his mum he'd pinched all that money, or his dad, and his dad made it into an idol, and then that was all good. No, it's not. That's not good. I don't know. But what it has, if you look in Acts 17 and verse 30, Paul tells us in the time of ignorance, God overlooked the ignorance and looks at their heart. And maybe is the Bible suggesting that we need to think very carefully about how we judge other people and other countries and other morals and other values? And we should look at the heart. I remember when I was in Sydney, my wife and myself did some work. My wife worked there and I volunteered at we called it an attendance centre. It was to do with the penal system. And if people had done crimes that were not quite bad enough to be sent to jail, they were sent to this group counselling. And I was one of the group counsellors. And interestingly, I was involved with the first sessions that went for once a week for probably 2 or 3 months. And you know what was our goal in the first session, that 2 or 3 months? Was to help those criminals realise they had a problem. So often they didn't have a problem. But there was one guy there that didn't have any problem accepting that he did have a problem. He was an Aboriginal. It was the end of summer, I'd been doing a lot of surfing, and the way I tan up, and with my eye, he says, "Oh, are you a brother?" And I thought, "Oh, does he know I'm a priest, brother?" Then I suddenly realised, no, he's wondering if I've got some Aboriginal blood in me. So I said, "Oh, not sure, mate. My dad used to sometimes say to my mum that, our dark skin might have come from an Aboriginal somewhere, and my mum used to deny it, and so he says, 'Oh, maybe you're one of the stolen generation.' So, but I gave him a lift home after a while. He had no way of getting home, and he described his life back home. He'd come from out west, one of the towns out west. Everyone drunk by 10 o'clock in the morning. And he was bringing his kids into the city to get away from the bad influences of that environment. But the relatives would then come to the city and wreck it for him. They'd all arrive at his house and expect him to look after them. And they'd bring their alcohol, and then they'd trash the area and the neighbours, and then he'd have to lose his house and move somewhere else. And finally, they moved house again. Didn't tell the relatives where they were living. The wife went back to the town. And so the relatives back there gang raped her because she was stuck up to teach him and his family a lesson. And it was only a day or two later when he was working as a plumber's assistant, and he was down a hole digging away, and the boss came along and told him, "Don't find any sacred bones down there." And everyone started laughing, and he just lost it. And he bashed up a few guys, and that's why he was there. Yeah. And I suppose I looked at him when I first arrived there and thought he was some bloke that just couldn't control himself and had bashed up a good plumber and put him in hospital, and why couldn't he learn to control himself? Yeah, I suppose I realised that everyone is a son of God in a way, operating in a world with different rules to me. Doing the best for his family. How do I assess and judge that? I remember too going to the Philippines, and going in Manila, and went with one of the teachers that had an outreach. They had a school, and that school in a fairly rundown part of Manila, and that school had another outreach in a squatter's town. Now, the squatter's town is where people squatted, as in they just didn't have any ownership of the house. They just, and those places were known that they're full of criminals. And he said, oh, well, would you like to come and, visit there? He said, oh, yeah, Manila? We're going into a rundown part of Manila, and then we're going to the worst part of the rundown part of Manila. An Aussie, I definitely didn't take my wallet with me. Left my mobile, and he said, no, you'll be fine. And so we did. The only way to get in actually was you hopped on a bamboo trolley car that had wheels on a railway line and got pushed over this river on the railway line, because that was basically the only way into where this village was. And when we got into this area, the houses, we visited one of the local deacons of the Adventist Church. There was an Adventist church, and the Adventist church probably would have been not even half the size of this. Probably just if you went from where the edge of the door is across, that's how narrow it was. And it was probably about as long as this, and they had over 150 people in there. Okay. Definitely not 1.5 metre distancing. And we visited the deacon and in their home, and their home was literally 4 metres by 2.5 metres. That was the home. It was like, and what amazed me about this, because this was known, and yes, 90% of the people lived there with petty crime. That's what they had to do to survive. And yet they assured me, you are very, very safe there, because they were good people, just in terrible circumstances. And that took me a little bit to get my head around it. And so I suppose the Jephthah story, I got hung up on, did he actually sacrifice his daughter or didn't he? Don't know. But what is very, very clear is that Jephthah comes from a terrible background, and he forgives. He forgives. He is led by God. He is led by God. He is generous. And he does the very best he can. As for his daughter, wow. What do we do with that? His daughter says, this is what is needed to save thousands of lives, and keep your word to the Lord. Jephthah, of course, is one of the greats of faith. So I suppose the first message that we get is that he forgives, agrees to help those who are rejected, is led by God to save his people, is true to his word, gives everything to God. It challenges my judgmental attitudes. How open am I to understand the dynamics that might be happening in people's lives and in cultures that I just can't understand the difficulties? How forgiving am I How in tune with God's will? And how much am I willing to sacrifice? You know, I come from an incredibly privileged direction, incredibly privileged background. You know, brought up in Australia, we're just so fortunate. Brought up in a Christian home. I'm just privileged from start to finish. We all are in Australia, just for a start, so many. The fact you're sitting here in church means you're privileged. You're privileged because you know the gospel and you know about God and you have a balanced morals and value system. The Jephthah that came from the worst, bikey, terrible abuse, he was willing to forgive and to give everything for God. I'm just wondering how easy I can forgive. I can forgive if you just little insults, but if you really insult me, that's not so easy to forgive. I don't mind giving $5 or $10 in the offering, but something that would sacrifice my family, I don't know. I remember my mum and dad when they had just started in ministry. There was a woman that came from a terrible background and she had nowhere to stay, and so she came and stayed in our house. I was just a little baby. She was a prostitute background at one stage, and she returned the favour by pinching the stuff out of the garden that Mum and Dad had to help survive. I don't know that I would do that. I wonder. Then there's Jephthah's daughter. I just thought I'd finish here. Verse 40 it says, young Israelite women would go away for 4 days each year to lament the fate of Jephthah's daughter. Anzac Day, we only give 1 day. But here the Israelite nation gave 4 days a year. Why? And I thought about it. In some ways, when you look at it, starts with a healthy religious celebration. So she comes out, celebrating. She let's read it there. She comes out, and when he returned home, she came out playing a tambourine, dancing with joy. So she was celebrating. She was doing a healthy, religious, joyful. Her father, God had helped him beat the enemy, had come home. And then what happens? He saw her, he tore his clothes and says, "Oh, my daughter." Oh, well, fair enough up to that point. But what does he say? "You have completely destroyed me. You have brought disaster on me." What? If that's not a dump, what is? If that's not religious abuse, what is? He wasn't owning his problem. He turned it on his daughter. He was incredibly upset. I have an ability to do this. Never my problem. Particularly when you're really upset and uptight, and he just had the high. He'd just beaten the enemy. That's not hard. That's been a pretty vicious, terrible adrenaline time to beat the enemy. And he comes home and he's on a high, and whoa, God's with him. He's going to sacrifice whatever comes out, and then his daughter comes out. You can imagine he's completely... We can think up all sorts of excuses for his abuse, but it is abuse. And how did she answer? she had a healthy reply. She didn't fly off the handle and said, "What? You flaming idiot! What would you do such a dumb thing for? And why are you telling me off? I was just praising God and being happy." She says, "Father, if you have made a vow," she has a healthy reply. She doesn't own his issue. "If you have made a vow, then if it means I'm going to save others, then so be it." Asks for time, doesn't get bitter, stays true in principle. And here, I think, is an incredible example of how to deal in a very healthy way with a religious abuse. And if you haven't been abused or seen things wrong in the church, then just wait around, because sooner or later, someone in the church is going to do something really bad and really wrong. It's going to hurt you, do things that are not fair. It'll be the pastor or the board or the whatever, and probably they didn't really mean it, or they were uptight like Gideon with all their own issues going on. But it doesn't justify it. Like what Mrs. White says here, we long to see reforms, and because we don't see what we desire, an evil spirit is too often allowed to cast drops of bitterness in our cup. And thus others are embittered. By our ill-advised words, their spirit is chafed. They are stirred to rebellion. Every sermon you preach may be all true, but one drop of bitterness in us will be poison to the hearer. Because of the drop of poison, one will discard all the good and acceptable words. Man, if anyone had a reason to be bitter, it's the daughter of Jephthah, wasn't it? But what an example, what an incredible example she gave. Yep, what an incredible example. And there she is as an example to us. As one writer put it, we are all Jephthah's daughters. In the end, like her, we all die, having lived incomplete lives, not having achieved the fulfillment we crave, and having yearned to create a lot more things that we were able to birth. In this life, nobody gets the full symphony. There's a place inside us when we all bewail our lost opportunities. I must admit, I visit around. You know, life is tough. Every one of you has a really tough story. Every one of us at times feels that something's been taken away from us. It's unfair. It's not right. And of course, since God's an all-powerful God, it's very easy to blame God. Why has my health been taken away? Why is my relationships? Why is my money? Why is my this? Why is my job? We can go on and on. What a powerful message. Powerful message. 2 key challenges from a strange story. Do your best for God to save others with what you have. Stay true and principled no matter what, and God will honour you. I wonder what message God is challenging you with, what God is saying to you from these strange stories in the Bible. May you be blessed as you reflect on them. Dear Lord, we thank you for the stories in the Bible. And as we read and reflect on this story of a young man that's really had nothing, everything against him, lots of unhappy, unfair stuff. And yet, when he was challenged by you to stand up and use his gifts for you, whatever he had, he did that. And then there was his daughter who just wanted to share in the joy of the victory that her dad had had. But because of the complication of unfair stuff, it really impacted her life. We don't know whether that was the end for her or whether whatever happened was miserable. But she was willing to accept the tough stuff in life if it meant the best for others. And she is honoured, and we know she will be honoured, and she will be there in heaven with her dad. And we thank you for that, and I ask that you'll be with everyone here. It'd be very unusual if not everyone here has either had tough stuff or is in the middle of tough stuff right now. Often unfair, not right. But sin, disease, all the stuff that happens because of sin is unfair. But may they and may we all be encouraged by the fact that no matter how bad or the circumstances, we can still stand up and be used by you. And ultimately, we can be honoured for eternity. And we ask that you'll help us all to live in such a way with whatever happens, so we can be with Jephthah and his daughter in heaven one day for Christ's sake. Amen.